So let's go ahead and get started. So today's topic is about choosing and effectively monitoring and managing an IT services provider. So a little bit about me, like Scott said, I've got a slightly different background than a lot of attorneys. I'm a second career attorney, and before I went to law school, I was a CIO for a mid-sized company. And I designed and delivered automation systems, among other things, and I was responsible to deliver high availability systems that ultimately Fortune 500 clients used in the fulfillment space, in the transportation space, in the digital marketing space, and so on and so forth. And it was the president of the company that I worked with that made the suggestion that I might want to go to law school and extend my career in the direction of law. And she was an attorney herself. So I thought, all right, there could be something to this. I checked into it. It turned out to be a wonderful match. So I ended up going to law school. And then once, of course, I graduated, I thought, what else to focus on in my practice than technology? It's something that was my first career, and now I can extend it in the direction of law. So that's a little bit about me. Let's talk about today's agenda. So first, we're going to start with practical considerations, which answers the question, well, what am I going to get out of this presentation, really, from a practical point of view? What am I going to get out of it? We'll talk about some key terminology. We'll talk about our professional duties, ethics, and how they relate to the selection and management of IT vendors. We'll briefly talk about the various types of IT vendors and the roles that they typically play, which will be a bit of a recap from the terminology piece, but you'll see why. And then the real meat of this presentation will be items 5, 6, and 7. It's how do we select, evaluate, onboard, manage, and supervise our IT vendor, and what are the signs that it might be time to maybe make a switch. But in order for us to be prepared for items 5, 6, and 7, we've got to get through items 1, 2, 3, and 4. All right, so let's get started. So the practical consideration, why should I carefully vet and manage my IT vendor? Well, there are 3 main reasons. First is the right IT vendor will reduce the risk of a cybersecurity event at your firm. So what does that really mean? It means that when you hire the right IT vendor, they are taking proactive steps to protect the access credentials that they use to access your systems, so that those access credentials don't end up in the wrong hands or don't become public, and therefore they continue to keep your system secure and help prevent a cybersecurity event. On the other hand, an IT vendor that might not be so right for you could be one that doesn't do a great job at managing and protecting access credentials of their clients, and consequently, if your IT vendor has a data incident, you could very well also have a data incident. Or your IT vendor might simply create circumstances that allow third parties to enter your computer systems. That could lead to a BEC, business email compromise, which could lead to wire fraud, could lead to a ransomware attack, or could lead to other serious issues. The second reason as to why we should carefully vet and manage our IT vendors is because it's part of our professional duties. We have a duty to supervise individuals that are not attorneys that are working for us. And so we'll show you an easy framework that lets us do that. And third, probably the most practical of all, is the right IT vendor will help us focus on running our practice, and we won't have to be worried about system security. We won't have to worry about outages, interruptions, and so on and so forth. All right, so How do we do this? Let's start with some terminology. I'm going to focus on the terms and the terminology that I think is most relevant for small practitioners, small firms, and solos, just like myself. And I'm going to maybe skip past some of the things that I think you're less likely to encounter, but nonetheless, they'll be here as well. And as Scott mentioned, there are additional resources that are available from ISBA Mutual that go into much greater depth than this presentation goes into, but it all comes from the same source. So I would suggest that you check that out. All right, so let's start with break fix. So a break fix service provider, pretty straightforward. This is a service provider that comes to your aid when something is broken, and they typically charge on a time and materials basis. Contrast that with a managed service provider or an MSP. An MSP will engage with you and provide preventative maintenance before things break. What are the common things that they provide? Well, patch management, network monitoring, data backup, data recovery, as well as oftentimes help desk support. So with an MSP, you have an ongoing relationship. You're typically paying a flat monthly fee, plus potentially some hourly fees on top of what's not covered by your flat monthly fee. So I talked about patches. So what are these patches? And they're pretty important. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the difference between patches, updates, and upgrades, and I'll show you some slides ahead that really drive these points home. So patches are small fixes to usually a security vulnerability or a bug in the product. And they're really not designed to do much else but to close that security vulnerability. So think of a patch as maybe a hole in your favorite 1980s jean jacket. You put that patch on, it's just going to fix that little hole, and now you're back up and running and you're ready to groove and rock out to your favorite 80s hits. All right? Updates, on the other hand, often contain not only patches, security fixes, but they add new features. So think about moving from, say, iOS version 17 to 17.1 or 17 to 17.5. Okay. Upgrades, on the other hand, are more or less wholesale replacements of software. And where do these patches, updates, and upgrades reside? What do they control? Well, they control and they affect your operating system, such as your Windows operating system or your Mac operating system, your specific computer programs, for instance, your installation of Microsoft Office or maybe some time billing software that you might have installed, as well as firmware. Firmware is the software that sits on your routers, for example. It sits on hardware that controls that hardware. Firmware controls that hardware. Routers, printers, those kinds of things. Okay, an endpoint, oftentimes connected with MSPs and security, has to do with anything that's connected to your network. So a computer that's connected to your network is considered an endpoint. MSPs often price their recurring fee based on the number of endpoints, and they might have different definitions of what they consider a billable endpoint versus a non-billable endpoint. Antivirus and anti-malware. The best way to summarize this is antivirus and anti-malware essentially is a list of no-flies. It's a no-fly list. What kinds of applications and what kinds of files are simply not allowed to fly on your computer. So once the antivirus or anti-malware application encounters something that it's on this no-fly list, this definition file, it will stop that process from running or even prevent that process from running. But the key takeaway is that it's a definitions-based file. It's a list. There's a list of known virus applications or malware applications that the traditional antivirus product stops. Anti-malware